Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. Tom Cobben speaking, and here to give you a short presentation on multiple sclerosis, MS, and how it can affect road usage and car insurance. It's a topic that often comes up, and at Beryl and Watson, whilst we focus on assisting people with insurance claims and often help a lot of people with MS, we also become involved occasionally in giving general advice about what ought to be done once diagnosed with a chronic or degenerative illness which can affect your capacity to drive a car. Comes up a lot, as you would expect. A lot of people are diagnosed with MS whilst still working or otherwise needing their license and transport to get around. And so these issues can be quite big and quite real for people in facing losing their license and not having that independence that comes with being able to drive around. But similarly, sometimes it can affect a person's capacity to work. So the question we're often asked is, do I have to tell the State Roads Authority that I have MS? And the answer is it's reasonably complicated, but the answer is that you only have to report your MS to the state authority if it can affect your driving. So if your MS is of a type, it manifests and presents and gives you symptoms in a way that means that you are less safe on the roads, then it is, in our view, something that you should disclose to the state authorities. This could mean that potentially you've got cognitive issues which are associated with the MS, or you suffer from extreme fatigue. Otherwise, perhaps some kind of involuntary movements, or optic neuritis, vision issues, or perhaps you've got difficulties where you might have sudden onset of numbness in your arms and legs. In these scenarios, it may be that these symptoms can come on without warning. And if that's the case, then it means that you can be a risk to yourself and others on the road. So having said that, though, if the symptoms are under control, if there's clear markers for you when you're about to have an attack or you're about to suffer from some numbness or neuritis, then we don't think you're necessarily able to necessarily need to tell the authority. It's a question of management, and it's really a medical question. So if you do think that you need to notify the State Roads Authority because your MS affects it, then you really should do so as soon as possible. And if you don't, there can be consequences for not having disclosed. Disclosing is different in all of the states of Australia, and in this presentation we focused on a handful of the states that we think will be most likely to be watching this presentation. So, but and I'll touch on this a bit more later in the presentation, but ultimately the decision about whether you need to notify really is one that's informed with your doctor. So it's a process of consulting with your doctor and deciding whether or not the MS is of a nature that the symptoms mean you need to disclose to the road authority, and your doctor will be someone that will be really valuable in that conversation. But more on that in a moment. Having decided that you do want to disclose, then in Victoria, you've got an obligation under the law to self-report, and you're strongly encouraged to discuss it in detail with your doctor about understanding your health condition, the MS, and the potential impact it has on driving. And that doesn't mean that the doctor makes a decision. It's your decision to make, in Victoria at least. In some other states, the health practitioner does have an obligation to disclose also. But that conversation, I think, is one that can generally happen in a common sense way. It can happen in a way where you say, all right, these are what my symptoms are. This is how I know I'm going to have a relapse, or this is what's happened in the past before. I've generally got good notice, or my symptoms are manageable, etc., etc. Depending on the conversation with your doctor, you may decide to disclose. Their requirements are a little bit different. They're on the screen there, so I expect that if you want to look at your particular state, you can pause and have a quick look at them rather than me read them out verbatim. So on the next slide, we're looking at what the requirements for self-reporting are in Tasmania, and again, they're reasonably similar across the states, but there are some variations. As I say, in some states, the doctor can mandatory report. In other states, the obligation is firmly on you. In most states, there is some kind of guideline. There's some kind of guideline for people to understand in what circumstances they may not be judged as fit to drive. And so you can look at those guidelines in advance normally, and that can guide you in your decision about whether or not to disclose. It can guide the conversations that you have with your doctor, and it can give you some control and some certainty about what's likely to happen in the event that you do disclose based on your symptoms in light of the guidelines. So I haven't replicated the guidelines here. They vary in state by state, but I think that if you are considering making a report, you're having these conversations with your doctor, have a look at those guidelines. Um, so what happens when you do notify? I think first and foremost, and most importantly, doesn't necessarily mean that your license is going to be taken off you. So the medical review in most cases will normally happen. There'll normally be input from your doctors. And if there's not input from your doctors immediately and you're unhappy with the decision which is made, you should get input from your doctors clarifying the positions which you're putting forward. But the medical review will assess your ability to drive, and you may have to undergo some OT assessments. And you can also engage private outside people at organisations like MS Plus to help you through that process in circumstances. If your symptoms are severe, your license could be suspended or at least or revoked entirely. Other times, what we see is conditional licenses being provided, or conditions that require you to drive a modified vehicle. And certainly, many of you probably will know through your support groups and whatnot. But in my practice, I have seen oftentimes people with quite profound limitations due to their MS still being able to drive with modifications. I can think of one gentleman that had lost the use of his legs almost entirely and was able to operate the motor car using his hands almost entirely. So the modifications can be extensive, and we can do all sorts of things to keep you on the road in a safe way, keep you mobile, keep you independent, because of course that's the most important thing for your social interactions with the world. You need to be able to get out there, and importantly, stay in the workplace if we can, but if not, at least be out and about and independent. So there's a bunch of things that can be done, and it's important to know that when you notify, it won't necessarily mean the end of your license. So what happens when you notify? Again, I'm not going to read out how everything varies from state to state. I don't think that's useful for you, but again, you can pause this presentation and have a read over those different aspects when you get a moment. Suffice to say that, as I said, in most states, there are things like the National Fitness to Drive guidelines, the variations on those themes between different states, and they can give you an idea in advance of what might happen when you notify. I think also GPs, doctors, specialists are quite well versed in understanding the limitations that are put in place, as are the experts at the MS Plus, who can give you some guidance if you're concerned. But in our view, ultimately, this is a situation where you need to have a good chat with your doctor and understand what they say, but similarly make sure they understand you. They understand you when you tell them what your symptoms are, how you're limited, and that you're engaged and have agency in the process. And as I say, just because you do report doesn't mean that your license will be revoked. However, that may not be the case for heavy vehicle users, particularly because they are often the dangers that are associated with driving those vehicles. So oftentimes when you do disclose a diagnosis of MS or associated symptoms, that may lead to very strict conditions being placed on your license, or the revocation of your license. Indeed, that can happen also. And again, this is case by case. This depends on how your MS manifests for you, how it impacts you. And as I've said in previous presentations, the onset of MS is different for all people. So it's very subjective. But having said that, the requirements for heavy vehicle users to have a license are significantly higher than for ordinary users, because of the dangerous nature of those vehicles, because they're bigger, because they're heavier, because they can do more damage, and because oftentimes they can be licensed to carry a number of people, and putting lots of lives at risk. So for those reasons, we do see that those requirements are much more stringent for heavy vehicle users than what we would see for general road users. Again, the same principles apply for notification of heavy vehicle users. Discussion with your doctors, and the process is very similar. So how to notify state by state. Once again, I'm not going to read verbatim. There is too much content on this slide. I acknowledge that, and I apologize for it, but it's designed to be a resource for you to have some quick guides on a state-by-state basis, rather than have to go away and do your own research. So I encourage you to pause, have a look at your particular state if you're thinking about doing this. Information along these lines will also be can be obtained from your GP and no doubt from MS Plus also. So with that in mind, you can have a look over those. The process is fairly similar across the different jurisdictions. In most cases, you can send an email. I would encourage everyone to have something from their doctor when they make the notification, particularly if they're hoping for an outcome other than losing their license, having it revoked. I would encourage you, if you're looking for modifications, to have something from your doctor already in place. So the next question that we're often asked, particularly because of the work that we do in insurance world, is do I have to disclose my MS to my car insurer? And the short answer is, again, it depends. And I'm sorry to be such a lawyer and give you so many it depends, so many lawyer answers. But ultimately, if we go back to basic insurance principles, when you apply for a policy of insurance, whether it be a life insurance policy or a general policy of insurance, it might be for car, home, boat, whatever it might be, when you do that, you have what's called a duty of disclosure, which means that you must disclose anything to the insurer uh, that a reasonable person, that yourself or a reasonable person knows to be relevant to the insurer's decision. And I've got the legislation on my screen here. So what it actually says is, subject to this act, an insurer has a duty to disclose to the insurer, an insured has a duty to disclose to the insurer before the contract is entered into every matter that they know to be a matter that is relevant to the decision of the insurer to accept the risk, that the risk of insuring them, or that a reasonable person in the circumstances could be expected to know to be a matter so relevant, having regard to factors including but not limited to the nature and the extent of the insurance cover and the classes of persons who are ordinarily expected to apply for that cover. So if we hone that into a car general insurance situation for a car insured, if you have an illness that makes you more likely to have an accident on the road, that makes you a greater risk for the insurer in insuring you, and you know that to be the case based on your interactions with doctors and your past history of symptoms and near misses, whatever it might be, then you will breach that duty if you don't tell the insurer about your MS. So you have that positive duty that you must tell them, and the reasonable person overlay is there. So you must tell them all the things that you know, or all the things that a reasonable person would know. So you need to tell them even things that you don't know to be relevant. You might say, "Oh, I'm not sure if it's relevant that I have MS." The question then would become, what would a reasonable person do? And that's very difficult for you to know. Uh, that's very difficult for you to understand. And so that's when we would say to you that you probably should discuss that with your doctor if you're unsure. Hey, doc, as you know, got MS, haven't been symptomatic for several years, well controlled with the various medications that I'm taking, whatever they may be. Do you think this is something that I should tell my insurer? And then I think the question would go something like, well, do you think there's an increased risk of you having an accident? Are you more likely, you haven't had a relapse for years, the medication's well controlled, controlling the illness? In that scenario, probably not. Probably you don't need to disclose to your insurer that you have MS, or at least that you have MS at all, because there's symptoms of it don't exist. You're no more risky than the average person. However, if you're in the midst of having ongoing relapse, the medication's not working, you're still very tired, whatever it might be affecting you, then possibly yes. You're taking heavy painkillers, this is a factor as well. You might be something that you do disclose to your insurer. And so again, we say there, speak to your doctors. So what happens if I don't tell the insurer? What happens if you don't tell them? Well, if you breach your duty of disclosure that I read out before, whether it be in a life insurance context or a car insurance context, whatever it might be, if you breach your duty of disclosure, then very broadly, the insurer has remedies. They have things that they can do. And what those remedies say, that is, if you breached the duty of disclosure, then they can avoid the policy as if it never existed. In other words, they can say, we gave you a policy in good faith on the basis of the things that you told us. A reasonable person in your circumstances would have known that MS was a factor. We're now not going to cover you under the policy. We're going to avoid the policy as if it never existed. Now, the technical position, there's a bunch of layers to that. I'm giving you a very broad sweeping summary of the legislation and how it works. But ultimately, that's what can happen in some circumstances. And that can happen even if the accident which you've undergone isn't related to the MS that you haven't disclosed. I mean, that would be unlikely, I think, but technically possible. So again, for this reason, uh, we recommend that you have discussions with your doctor about whether disclosure is required. And the factors that I mentioned before are going to be key to that conversation. Similarly, if you do have an accident which is caused by the MS, I think, and it wasn't disclosed, and it ought to have been, if the history or the pattern of the insurance leading up to that time was such that it was a risk factor, then that's going to be a big problem. So, and the important thing is that we understand that that duty of disclosures in a car insurance situation, that duty of disclosure is ongoing. So every time you renew your policy, that duty exists. So if your MS has been well controlled for many years, but you're going through a particularly difficult patch, and maybe the disclosure is required in that 12-month renewal. So when you get those documents in the mail or via email, and you read them and you look at how much the premiums increase, because it seems to increase every year, uh, and you look at what you're insured for and notice that your car's worth far less than you thought it was, these types of things, in that process, you are technically required to update your insurer about any changes in that may affect your ability or your risk factor for them. And so that it's important to understand that duty of disclosure is ongoing, and those conversations with your doctor need to be ongoing as well. Yeah, and if, as I say, if it's not disclosed, the policy may be avoided. That means not only do you not get your car back, do you not only not get paid for the claim, you may be liable for others for the damage that you cause, because your insurance provides not only can provide third-party cover as well. So you may be liable to other people for their car damage, or even if you crash into a building or something more serious, you may be liable for that damage as well. So something you don't want to get wrong. If you find yourself in that situation, or you've got questions or concerns, particularly with respect to the insurance aspects of this video, we're more than happy to have a chat with you. We give free advice to people, often have those conversations with people without charge, and give them some pointers about, as I say, particularly the insurance aspect, but similarly the road accident or the road authority reporting requirements. More than happy to take your call. Feel free to give us a buzz. So I've been Tom Cobben from Beryl and Watson Lawyers. Thanks for listening.